It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio indeed is in your future. This segment, really an extraordinary story we're going to be talking about here. The work is called Alex's Wake, a voyage of betrayal and a journey of remembrance. The author is Martin Goldsmith. He is well known as the host and classical music programmer for Sirius XM Radio's Symphony Hall. He also hosted for a decade from 89 to 99 NPR's Performance Today. Also the author of another book called The Inextinguishable Symphony. And anyway, this is a tremendous story, a tremendous look back. We'll get into much more detail, obviously, throughout the course of the interview. Martin, how are you, my friend?
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me on, Warner.
Well, thank you for joining us. I think this is it's an important story and one that is just really unique. Let's do this. Before we dive into the work Alex's Wake, let's give our listeners a little bit of background. Again, radio sort of at the national level has been your life for the last 25, 30 years. Tell us how you got into the industry to begin with.
Well, it was a bit of a fluke, actually. I was living in Cleveland, where my mother was a member of the Cleveland Orchestra, which meant that she knew Robert Conrad, the vice president and general manager of WCLV in Cleveland, the classical music station in Cleveland, and the station that broadcast concerts by the Cleveland Orchestra. And one day, she and my father were out riding their bicycles, and they ran into Bob Conrad on the streets, and they began talking about music matters. And my mother asked Bob Conrad how things were at WCLV, and he said, well, I'm really sort of in need of someone who can announce classical music for us. And my mother said, well, I have a son at home. He can pronounce the name Stanislav Skrovichevsky. And Bob Conrad said, well, send him down. And so I was brought down to WCLV in the Terminal Tower in Cleveland, where I auditioned the next day, and I was put on the air the day following, and that was way back in 1971. So I've been doing radio now for just about 43 years.
So you didn't need to know John, Paul, George, or Ringo. You needed to know the classics.
Exactly right.
Okay. So you've been in the classical music side of the radio industry for quite a while. Let me ask you something. Everybody in our business gets asked this. Ever interest in doing any television work?
Well, of course, I was connected with WETA-FM here in Washington, D.C., which is a public radio station connected to WETA Television, a public television station, and if there's anything that public television is known for, other than the Masterpiece Theater and McNeil Lehrer, it is, of course, pledge drives. And I did my share of getting on camera and asking people to call up and get this really marvelous tote bag with your pledge right now. So I've had my occasional stints in front of the TV cameras.
Well, okay, so Martin Goldsmith, well known as classic music radio personality and putting the music front and center, obviously. Let's talk about Alex's Wake. This is uniquely personal and an important story. Give our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, just a general setup for the book.
My grandfather, Alex Goldschmidt, and my uncle, Helmut Goldschmidt, were two of the more than 900 Jewish refugees attempting to flee Nazi Germany in 1939 aboard the infamous refugee ship, the St. Louis. This was the ship that left Hamburg in May of 1939, bound for Cuba, but when it arrived in Havana, it was discovered that power play politics in the Cuban government made it impossible for more than just a handful of the refugees to disembark in Havana. The St. Louis then weighed anchor and sailed north to the coast of the United States, where it plied the waters off Florida for several days. The captain of the ship imploring President Roosevelt for permission to land in Miami, but that was denied. The ship then sailed back east. Also, it requested the opportunity to land in Halifax, but the Canadian government also turned the ship aside. So the St. Louis sailed back to Europe. A deal was brokered whereby the passengers on board the St. Louis can disembark in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland. My grandfather and uncle disembarked in France. They then spent the next 3 years being sent from one concentration camp in France to another before being shipped to their deaths in Auschwitz in 1942. And then 3 years ago, my wife and I followed in their footsteps from the little village in Lower Saxony where my grandfather was born in 1879 to the city of Oldenburg in Germany where he established his business, then to Hamburg from where the ship sailed in 1939. We then metaphorically met up with them in Boulogne-sur-Mer, the town on the north coast of France where they landed in June of 1939. We then spent the next 6 weeks traveling to all of those places in France where they were held and finally to Auschwitz. So the book, Alex's Wake, is a story of those two journeys 70 years apart.
Martin, this was it a difficult decision for you to do this journey, or was it somewhat sort of an epiphany at some point?
Much more the latter, Warner. My father died at the age of 95 in 2009, and then within less than a year, my brother unexpectedly died of a heart attack. He was only 60 years old, and I had written about my father and mother and their experiences playing in an all-Jewish orchestra in Nazi Germany. That book you mentioned, The Inextinguishable Symphony. And in my grief for my father and brother, it came to me that I really needed to write another book about my family, and I had always been interested in this journey of the St. Louis, the voyage of the St. Louis. So it came to me one night that was what I needed to do. I needed to follow in the footsteps of my grandfather and uncle and tell their story and once more bear witness.
I want to dive into just a little bit of detail here. The St. Louis sails from Hamburg in 1939 and then is denied entry into the United States. I want to examine that right there. Tell us the circumstances around that, and was the denial a unique act to the St. Louis versus any other boats attempting to enter?
In 1939, this would be by the time the St. Louis left Cuban waters and headed north to the coast of Florida, it was early June 1939. The United States was under the restrictions of the 1924 Immigration Act, which had quotas for the number of people from various countries around the world who would be allowed to enter the United States legally. And there were a certain number of people from Germany and Austria who could legally enter the United States in, for instance, 1939. And the reason given at the time was that if a special exemption were made for the passengers on board the St. Louis, if they were allowed to land, say, in Miami, that would be 900 people from Germany or Austria who had gone through all of the proper procedures and had filled out all the proper papers, who would be pushed farther back down the line. And it was determined at the time that just wouldn't be fair. So that was one of the reasons given. It has also been speculated that President Roosevelt was attempting to overturn what were called the Neutrality Acts, which had been passed in 1936, 1937, and 1938 by the U.S. Congress. Mr. Roosevelt saw what was going on in Europe and wanted to have his hands untied, both economically and militarily, and he was hoping to overturn these Neutrality Acts, which did tie his hands. And it's been speculated that he thought, well, if I, for instance, issue an executive order to allow the St. Louis to land, I will lose the support of some Southern senators in my party, and therefore it's not worth it for me to undergo that kind of political difficulties, so I will just keep things as they are. And there was the fact that in June 1939, Mr. Roosevelt was planning what was going to be his unprecedented third term as president, and
right.
He did not want any immigration issues to come up during the campaign. So these were all reasons why he acted the way he did.
Well, there were, okay, we'll come back to this later, but let's now, and again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck here of Lewis at Large Radio. We are in the midst of a really interesting talk here with Martin Goldsmith. You know him as the host and classical music programmer of Sirius XM's Symphony Hall, but he has been in the national radio scene related to classical music for quite some time. But his second work here called Alex's Wake, an extraordinary voyage of betrayal and journey of remembrance. Let's talk now about the journey itself. Share with our listeners, if you would, your departure from the States and take us through it.
Well, Warner, it took a while for me to figure out where I wanted to go, because when I first began this idea of following in my grandfather's and uncle's footsteps, I knew that they'd been on the St. Louis. I knew that they had returned to France in June of 1939, but then there was an 18-month gap. I knew that they had entered the French camp called Rivesaltes in the southwest part of France near the Pyrenees Mountains in January of 1941. I knew that they had entered the French camp called Les Milles in July of 41, and that they'd been sent to Auschwitz in August of 1942. But I didn't know where they were between June of 39 and January of 41. So I went to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and Museum here in Washington to do some research, and with the help of the extraordinary archivists there at the museum, I learned where they had spent their time, these little villages, first where they landed in Boulogne-sur-Mer, then they were sent to what was called at the time an agricultural retraining center in Martigny-les-Bains, which is the northeastern part of France near Nancy, France. They spent a couple of idyllic months there in July and August of 1939, but then came September 1st, 1939, the beginning of the Second World War. France and Germany were now enemies, and my grandfather and uncle metamorphosed in the eyes of their captors from displaced persons and refugees to enemy aliens, since they, after all, carried still German passports. So then they were sent to a camp in Sion, France, then to Montauban, then Agde, and then to Rivesaltes and Les Milles. So it was a matter of figuring out just where they were. Then it was a matter of going to the map and finding out where all these places were, and figuring out that it would take about 6 weeks for us to follow in their footsteps. And I actually, Warner, began the whole trip with a certain amount of trepidation, just in that I was regarding this trip as a tribute to my grandfather and uncle, and yet recognized that they made their way through France when they were shunted from camp to camp on cattle cars and at the point of a gun.
Yeah.
Whereas my wife and I would be traveling in an air-conditioned car down very lovely French highways and byways, and staying in nice inns and eating the famous French cuisine. And I was troubled by the fact that this might, in fact, turn out to be something of a mockery of my relative's journey. But eventually I came to terms with the fact that it was indeed a journey of remembrance.
What, Martin, what was the general reaction and feeling of your other family members? They obviously knew the story. Supportive? Where were they through all this?
Well, as I write in the book, Warner, with the death of my brother, I was the last Goldsmith standing. My mother died in 1984. My father, as I said, had died in 2009. That was it. My wife and traveling companion, I certainly didn't have to convince her of the importance of the idea. So it was the two of us just heading down the road and visiting all of these fascinating places.
As your journey went on, I'm curious how were you handling it emotionally? Was it becoming more difficult? Was it becoming more enlightening? Was it becoming more, oh gosh, this doesn't feel like a mockery, but I'm not getting what I thought I would get out of this? Kind of describe your emotions as the trip unfolded.
Well, it was quite fascinating, actually, Warner. Every time, my grandfather and uncle, after all, were murdered in Auschwitz 10 years before I was born. I knew very little about them. My father had saved some letters that they had sent to him from these French camps. But I have had, and my parents managed to escape Germany with their lives and very little else. So I had very little tangible evidence of my grandfather and uncle. So if I would go to one of these places and find evidence that they had been there, police records, for instance, photographs, letters, it was very, very exciting and simultaneously extremely saddening to realize that they had been to these places under duress. So it was both of those things that you mentioned. It was exciting. I felt I was on the trail of these people, but each time, and certainly as their journey through France continued, their lot became worse and worse, and they were living with fewer and fewer rations, and the conditions under which they were existing became increasingly bad. So it was every day was it was curious. I would wake up curious to find out which would win out, excitement or sorrow on that particular day.
And again, we're with Martin Goldsmith. We're talking about Alex's Wake, a brand new work, a voyage of betrayal and journey of remembrance, as he retraces the steps and the journey of his grandfather and uncle in the midst of Nazi Germany. Martin, as you would talk with locals and interact with the locals, were they at a restaurant or at a hotel or just at a retail location somewhere? Did you share a little bit about what you were doing? And if you did, I'm curious as to the reaction you got from those in Germany.
Well, not so much at a retail establishment, but wherever I went, I had established email contact with people, and so they knew that I was coming there to trace the history of my grandfather and uncle, and the people I met along the way were extraordinarily helpful. In Montauban, a city about 40 miles north of Toulouse in France, where my grandfather and uncle were held in a cookie factory for a couple of months in 1940, I met this extraordinary gentleman named Jean-Claude Rouillet, whose father had been a member of the French resistance, whose uncle had been taken away to the German camp of Buchenwald and murdered there. And he was someone who wanted to help me because he considered it an extension of his family's determination to resist the Nazis. So wherever I went, whether it was some of the docents at the camps, which are now, a couple of which are being turned into museums, Rivesalt and Les Milles, an archivist in Agde on the banks of the Mediterranean, another camp where my grandfather and uncle were held. Everyone I met was extraordinarily helpful and kind and made our journey of discovery a good deal easier. I'm curious as to, in your discussions and your exchanges with these people, are they still feeling a sense, not the word remorse is not correct, are they still feeling they need to either explain or apologize for everything that had happened, or is it just all implied and unstated? I met in Drancy, which is a suburb of Paris, which had an infamous camp from where, in fact, my grandfather and uncle were sent to Auschwitz. In Drancy, I met a woman who now lives in Paris. She's a filmmaker there. She was born in Oldenburg, which is the town where my father was born, where my grandfather had his woman's clothing store. And she and her husband drove us from our hotel in downtown Paris up to Drancy, the suburb. And I learned from her that her father had been a member of the Nazi Party, and that she, though she's just about my age, didn't really learn much about the Nazi past of her city until she read my first book, which is how we managed to find each other. And yes, she definitely expressed remorse, not that she personally had anything to apologize for, but the fact that she came from a family with a Nazi past. She was very apologetic. Jean-Claude Drouillet felt that certainly the French have reasons to apologize. Uh-huh. But I was struck, Warner, throughout my time in both Germany and France, the degree to which the events of 70, 75 years ago are current events. People talk about them almost as if they happened, last month or maybe a couple of years ago. And there is a real sense that something still needs to be done. I mean, as I say, these two camps where my grandfather and uncle were held towards the end of their French captivity, Zemil and Rivesaltes, they're both being turned into national museums. And there are museums and Holocaust memorials dotting the landscape in Germany. And it certainly came to me that France and Germany, it could be said, are dealing with these black marks on their past, perhaps in a more healthy manner than the United States is when we try to sweep slavery under the rug or the attempted annihilation of the Native American population, and we either pretend that it didn't happen or it happened a long time ago, and there's no reason, bringing these unfortunate topics up now. I think that we as a country have something to learn from the Germans and the French in that regard.
Yeah. Martin, as we begin to wind down here, this has been, I would think at some level, I'm not sure whether it's life-changing, but it's certainly mindset-changing. Would you share with our audience when you were done, tell us how it changed you, altered the way you look at things, confirmed, redirected you? Tell us all of that.
Well, Warner, that's a very good question, and I think it was one of the unconscious reasons that I wrote the book. I describe early on that my grandfather and uncle, when they were held in these camps in France, and after June of 1941, when my mother and father managed to escape Germany and make it to New York City, that my grandfather and uncle wrote these letters to my father, and they described their conditions under which they were living in France, and they repeatedly said, do everything you can in your power to get us out of here. And I wrote in that first chapter of the book that my father and mother, hampered though they were by being recent immigrants and making very, very little money, they did a few things on behalf of their family, but probably not everything they possibly could have. They certainly didn't know what was over the horizon. Nobody knew about the final solution in 1941. But nevertheless, after the war and after seeing all of the grisly newsreels and newspaper reports, my father took on an enormous amount of guilt and shame over what had happened to his family. And as I write in the book, I inherited a good deal of that. A lot of us second-generation people, I think, are burdened with a sense of guilt and shame and unhappiness over what had happened long before we were born. But in the course of writing the book and in the course then of seeing to it that a plaque was affixed to the side of the wonderful house in Oldenburg where my grandfather and his family used to live. I attended that ceremony of establishing the plaque on the side of the house in September of 2012. And at the end of the book, I realized that this long journey has left me certainly with a certain reservoir of sadness over what happened to my family, but those feelings of guilt and shame were largely overcome. So in the course of writing the book and in the course of the book itself, I do make a journey from, as I write, the turbulence of following in Alex's wake all those many years to a certain degree of peace and happiness and satisfaction with my family and my friends and my life.
Yeah. I'm sure it was cathartic and resolved many things and let you work through things, almost sort of therapeutic indeed. Unfortunately, we are running out of time here. The work is Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance, published by Da Capo. Martin, how can people get a copy of the book and find out more about your work?
Well, I hope in the KU bookstore might carry it, but certainly Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, any online place that you care to shop, you can certainly find it, both in hardback and in these newfangled digital devices called Kindles and Nooks and everything. They're available in various formats. In fact, I also recorded the audio version of the book, so if your listeners enjoy listening to books as they're driving down the road, that's another option.
Great. Listen, thank you so much for spending time with us. Carry on your fine work on Sirius XM on the Symphony Hall, and again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Warner.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.